Good evening, everybody. Our distinguished guest and lecturer, Professor Pierre Nora, dear colleagues and friends, Professor Miriam, Eliav-Feldon, Professor Vinitzky-Seroussi. I'm thrilled to open this meeting. We have the honor and privilege to host Professor Pierre Nora, a member of the Académie Française, a cultural pillar, a historian who paved a new way in the research of history, in the notion of memory. Professor Nora was willing to take part in the conference held yesterday. And as soon as he expressed his will to do it, Professor Vinitzky-Seroussi suggested to invite him to deliver a public lecture at the Academy. And with her assistance, I wrote a letter to Professor Nora saying as follows: the news about your participation and your coming visit caused much excitement among the scholarly community in Israel. Since the conference is multidisciplinary and we would like to give the public at large an opportunity to hear you at length, we would like to ask you if you are able to give a public lecture in Jerusalem at the Israeli Academy the day following the conference, namely today. Such a lecture will be no less than a great present, in fact, a rare opportunity to students, scholars at the beginning of their career, old scholars who were inspired by your work, and the public at large, to hear you and be able to tell the next generation that they actually saw Nora. We would not underestimate the power of unmediated memory of you. So here we are with Professor Nora, who was willing to give us a great present. He will talk about memory, liberty, and tyranny. Yesterday, in the wonderful symposium we held here, Professor Fried mentioned briefly the story of Borges, Funes, his memory. Funes, after falling off his horse at the age of 19, finds that he is unable to forget anything. And I cite, Funes perceived every grape that had been pressed into the wine and all the stalks and tendrils of its vineyard. He was able to reconstruct every dream, every daydream he had ever had. 2 or 3 times he had reconstructed an entire day. End of citation. We long for an infallible memory that would enable us to collect details and acquire knowledge that would help us remember and learn everything with ease. However, perhaps so as not to torment ourselves too much, Borges tells us at the end of the story that he suspects Funes was not very good at thinking. To think is to ignore or forget trifling differences, to generalize, to abstract. In the world of Funes, there was nothing but particulars, and they were virtually immediate particulars. End of citation. So, Funes' story, which begins ostensibly as a song of praise to memory, soon becomes a lament upon its curse. Funes shows us why we need forgetting mechanism to act upon the cognitive and emotional spheres. So we are here to hear Pierre Nora about the two faces of memory, liberty and tyranny. He will be presented by my dear friend, the renowned historian, Professor Miriam Eliav-Feldon, the chairperson of the Historical Society of Israel. Later on, after the lecture by Pierre Nora, Professor Vinitzky-Seroussi, a renowned sociologist, the Dean of Social Sciences at the Hebrew University, will relate to the lecture and comment on it. Thank you for coming, and please, Miri.
Thank you very much, Professor Nili Cohen, for your kind words and for inviting me to present tonight's illustrious guest of the Israel Academy and to add a warm welcome on behalf of the Historical Society of Israel. It is indeed an honor and a pleasure. Yet it is also an intimidating occasion, and for a moment I toyed with the idea of taking the easy way out, which is not unknown among chairpersons in academic conferences, of simply saying, Professor Nora needs no introduction to this learned audience. However, I suspect that this is not what Professor Cohen had in mind when she invited me, so I shall say a few more words. Professor Nora is indeed an intellectual of amazing erudition and of outstanding international fame and renown, a standing which my own university, Tel Aviv, has recognized by awarding him the Dan David Prize in 2014. But rather than summarize the entry about him in Wikipedia, I should like to emphasize what Professor Nora's work has meant to my generation of historians, as well as to our students in the last decades. Professor Nora has been labeled a member of the third generation of the Annales School, together with Jacques Le Goff, Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie, Marc Ferraud, and Philippe Ariès, and for introducing what was called in the 1970s Nouvelle Histoire, New History, with its emphasis on cultural history and on the history of mentalité. The more conservative historians among my teachers in those years, both here in Jerusalem and then in England, huffed and puffed and warned us against such newfangled ideas. But for us, the young scholars at the time, these new approaches to history were a most exciting revolution, a breath of fresh air, and they immediately colored our own research and writing. And it is a testimony to their immense value that their work, and in particular Pierre Nora's contribution on the subject of sites of memory, is still cited and relied upon by all young scholars of today, both historians and those working in neighboring fields. Moreover, in addition to his contribution to historical knowledge and methodology, Professor Nora represents, in my view, aspects of academic life that I believe should serve as a model to us all. Although admittedly the intellectual arena in France is quite different from our own. First, Professor Nora has served as a high school teacher and continued to influence the ways history was taught in French schools for many decades, a mission which we here must all the more urgently take upon ourselves and which the Historical Society is attempting to encourage. Second, he took and still takes an active part in publishing, and among his other contributions in that area, he helped to establish two important series at Editions Gallimard, the Library of Social Sciences and the Library of Histories. Third, he founded the review Le Débat, which serves as an important venue for intellectual debates on history and on contemporary social and political issues. And fourth, he was one of the founders and presidents of the association's Freedom for History, aimed at defending historiography from political interference, something we, here and now, should do our utmost to struggle for. Thus, his immense contribution to French and to international culture consists not only in the famous lieux de mémoire, sites of memory, but just as much in teaching, publishing, and participation in public life and intellectual debates. And for all these, we are most grateful. On a lighter note, allow me to conclude with a personal anecdote on how I had been liberated from the tyranny of memory. In a sense, quite different than from Professor Nora's use of these terms. I had begun very long ago my academic career with the intention of specializing in Soviet history. Therefore, I was asked to teach at the Hebrew University a few elementary courses on 20th century history. But in every class I taught and every lecture I gave, there was always an older person, whom the Americans euphemistically call a mature student, who would raise his hand and say, "Ah, you youngsters, you receive all your knowledge from books. I, however, remember the facts. I was there," whether it was the Spanish Civil War or World War II or during Stalin's purges. I remember and therefore I know. After a while, I decided that I urgently needed to change course and find myself a field where no one could say, "I remember." And thus I found myself deep in the 16th century. Nowadays, however, the danger of someone in class raising a finger and saying, "I know," comes not from private memories, but, as Professor Nora is going to mention in his talk, from knowledge, both accurate and false, being accessible electronically, so that the student can look it up with amazing speed on his iPad or his smartphone. This is perhaps another form of tyranny from which there is no escape. Now again, allow me to welcome our distinguished guest, Professor Pierre Nora, who will speak today on memory from freedom to tyranny. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Well, in case some of you have already attended yesterday's symposium on memory, where I was asked to speak of the rise of memory, they might notice a few similar remarks, especially at the beginning of this lecture. But after all, I am an old professor repeating the same story. And for all others, I have written my lecture in French and translated in English. So I shall read it with my awful accent, with which you are accustomed now from yesterday. Well, what I shall try to highlight here is that the worldwide surge memory over the last 30 years has been an extraordinarily liberating phenomenon and at the same time terribly burdensome, both an emancipatory force and a form of tyranny. To understand this, we need to recall the mechanism underlying this hegemony of memory over history. The advent of memory intersects with two important phenomena, each containing its share of liberty and its burden of restrictions. One is a temporal phenomenon, the other a social one. Memory holds over the contemporary world is ultimately linked, it seems to me, to a breakdown in the traditional structuring of time in terms of past, present, and future, relations between the three terms had long been presented as a linear continuity, ordered since the Renaissance by our idea of the future. Broadly speaking, three frameworks could be used to envisage that future. The idea of a restoration of the past time, a return to a golden age. The idea, on the contrary, of progress in every domain, especially science, which in the 19th century was the main driving force behind the general progress of mankind. And last but not least, the idea of a revolution to be prepared, which would transform the human and social condition. And history, for the most part, was written by separating out from the past whatever was needed to prepare the future. Something of that noble continuity was lost when these three conceptual frameworks fell into decay at virtually the same moment. The idea of a return to a former state of affairs faded with the advance of industrialization. The idea of a general progress was shattered by Auschwitz and Hiroshima, and the idea of a revolution melted away with the breakup of the USSR. The world changed dramatically. The future became utterly unforeseeable, and the acceleration of history was so swift, the change so rapid, that the result was an ever more swiftly retreating past. Future and past have grown dimmer, and between the two, it is the present that has gained in power. This is a driving force behind the advent of memory as it is understood today. In a traditional structuring of memory, history organized time as a continuous narrative. The present was simply a crossing point, a bridge between what came before and what came after. The present has now become the main category of time through which we understand ourselves. So much so that the historian François Hartog has baptized our current order of history presentism. It is the explosion of historical and temporal continuity that gives memory its contemporary relevance. Memory, as it is defined today, is no longer what we need to preserve from the past to prepare the future. It is what makes the present present to itself. The meaning of the present, in other words, has changed profoundly. It is no longer simply a crossing point, but has been invested with historical self-awareness. On one hand, the increasing rapidity with which we are uprooted from the past fosters an anxiety of loss, a compulsive need to preserve and enshrine. On the other, the dimming of the future and of the society as a physical embodiment of memory, it's... Oh, yes? What happens with... No. Please, excuse me. Yes. Yes. Well, on the other, the dimming of the future and the uncertainty that hangs over it makes it hard to know what needs to be preserved from the past to prepare for that future, and by the same token, inclined to keep everything. Hence, our reluctance to destroy. Hence, the pious and somewhat obsessive manner in which we stockpile, as it were, any testimony, document, image for monument, and visible trace or material sign of the present or the past that will tell you how descendants what we are and what we will have become. The present, in other words, is now inextricably bound up with memory. The rise of a conception of the present invested with this urgent duty to remember is the defining mark of our era, as it were. The expression duty to remember originally had an ethical meaning and was bound up with the memory of the Shoah. It was the Shoah that gave rise to the duty of remember, and the fact that the genocide was the genocide of the people of memory only reinforced the connection, no doubt, between this major traumatic event in the West and the urgent rise of memory. The Shoah became a sort of memorial matrix and metaphor for the 20th century. The duty to remember, however, soon broke loose from its strict moral meaning and took on a broader and more inflated, a more mechanical and concrete meaning, a meaning linked to the notion not of death, but of loss. In particular, the duty to remember is directly responsible for the importance that the concepts of public archives and heritage have acquired in the public mind and in the contemporary imagination. The two concepts are linked and have undergone the same profound transformation, a shift in meaning to beginning with. In the past, public archives were the parts of society it no longer needed, the scraps of all leftovers. The inflation of memory we are witnessing today has placed archives at the very heart of society as a physical embodiment of memory, its concrete, visual precipitate. The various institutions of memory, museums, libraries, national archives, public records office, databases have multiplied prodigiously. At the same time, heritage was defined until the late 60s, 70s as the financial assets inherited from one's father and mother. Then, all of a sudden, it came to mean, even in dictionaries, cultural goods and the heritage of mankind. This shift in meaning was accompanied by a proliferation in crude material terms. Today's societies generate prodigious quantities of archives, both public records and commercial or private archives. You only have to think of the mass of papers we are obliged to preserve: identity cards, bills of receipts and receipts, legal documents, bank accounts, family photos and albums, government paperwork. Contemporary society have turned us into archivists of our own lives. Think, too, again in relation to the individual, of the prodigious growth of memoirs as a genre. In the past, memoirs were the preserve of the great figure of history, individuals whose personal lives were intimately bound up with the life of society. Now, who nowadays isn't he tempted to put down the story of his life in writing? The same is true of the concept of heritage, a term that traditionally referred in the public mind solely to stately homes, churches, outstanding public monuments, or major works of art, museums, and the riches found there. The concept has since been broadened in any number of directions, a broadening in chronological terms that has led to the legal protection of 19th and 20th century architecture and the rehabilitation, for example, of pompiers and contemporary art. Thank you. A broadening that extends to every conceivable category of object or locality and has led to the legal protection of certain historic town centers, landscape painted by the Impressionists, for instance, vestiges of peasant life, farms, wash houses, rural artifacts, and one thing leading to another, to every conceivable token of past life. Who knows? I myself may have contributed to this inflation of meaning by introducing the notion of realms of memory, lieux de mémoire, in 1984, in the name of which more than 300 realms in France are now subject to legal protection, such as the railway carriage at Rotonde, where the armistice of 1918 was signed, or the Café du Croissant, where Jean Jaurès was assassinated in August 1914. To these concrete material extensions may be added oral traditions, live entertainment, and everything that in the English-speaking world is called the intangible cultural heritage, a preliminary list of which has been drawn up in a UNESCO convention alongside the World Heritage. In that list, you can find, for example, the Royal Ballet of Cambodia and Gregorian chant. It shows what can happen when the concept of heritage is taken to an extreme, to say nothing of its metaphorical extension, since we now speak of a linguistic, genetic, or constitutional heritage. We can see how far we have come. We have moved from a sense of heritage that was peripheral to the market economy to one that is installed at the very heart of the system. From a heritage that was handed down by the past to a heritage without borders and always infinite in scope. And we are still only at the dawn, a far more radical transformation of concepts of public archives and heritage, a metamorphosis all too clearly heralded by the advent of digital and other new technologies, such as the internet and mobile phone. This time, it is a radically new era that lies before us, as it was beautifully and yesterday said by Professor Matthias. storage capacity is becoming unlimited. The idea of a tout-mémoire, which had always been slightly utopian, is accompanied by instrument of integral conservation. It's no longer a question of steadily increasing the capacity of memory, of enriching public archives and heritage, but of a full-blown revolution to preserve the memory of all mankind. With widespread digital networking and the miniaturization and democratization of these new technologies, the entire system of production, conservation, consumptions, and sharing of the different aspects of heritage is turned upside down. To take just a small one example, 10 years ago, 450 billion individual photographs had already been accounted for in the world, the equivalent of 50 million photographs an hour over a period of 1 year. And the embedding of this material is final, eternal, one might say, since any form of the digital data can now be transferred from one technology to another. In short, we are moving from a storage-based to a flow-based form of heritage. Hitherto, the concept of heritage referred to reality by gathering and sifting a stock of data, by preserving or destroying stable material entities and media. The eruption of new technologies geared towards a purely virtual heritage couldn't be more different, since it consists of the quasi-instantaneous recording of a self that mankind would carry around like a sort of virtual shell, a nightmare, a horrific prospect. But does it even make sense to speak of a heritage at this stage? A no less weighty concern is raised by the other reason of the surge in memory, which I mentioned at the beginning. A reason informed by the same dialectic of liberating release and unwarranted transgression, but rooted this time in a social rather than a temporal phenomenon. I am referring, of course, to the powerful emancipatory trend among people's groups and even certain classes of individuals in the world today. It is a worldwide phenomenon, since it was brought about by the historical, geographical, and political upheavals that affected the entire world in the latter part of the 20th century. In one part of the world, it meant the transition from colonial rule to the vicissitudes of independence. In other, the emergence from communist rule and the arduous renewing of ties with a memory that had been confiscated, suppressed, rewritten. Everywhere, it meant massive urbanization and the disruption this causes in the immutabilities characteristic of rural societies. In industrial, democratic societies, it meant domestic transformation of the contradiction of the condition of social life. To broaden the terms of discussion, we might draw on the distinction made by the German philosopher Walter Benjamin between transmitted memory and experienced or acquired memory. Transmitted memory is everything that is handed down from one generation to the next. Our memories of events, the ways in which we live and feel, our modes of thinking and reasoning, an educational heritage, therefore, one which includes history and the teaching of history. Acquired or experienced memory, on the other hand, is what happens only to ourselves in a world that has undergone upheavals as dramatic as those of the 20th century. There is clearly less and less transmitted memory and more acquired memory, with the latter often freeing itself from transmitted memory and rebelling against it, against history, in other words. A good example of this conflict between memory and history is that of France. Allow me to elaborate on this for a moment, firstly because it is the example I am most familiar with, but also because it's particularly transparent and enlightening. In this old nation state, formed by bringing together a wide variety of regions, populations, and languages, unity was imposed from the top down by central authority, be it monarchic, revolutionary, or republican. Each of these powers wrote its own version of history. With the founding of the Third Republic and the stabilization of Republican France, it was to the teaching of history that befell the task of reconciling the Ancien Régime and the Revolution, of making one France out of two, monarchic and republican, religious and secular, right and left. The classroom became the instrument of that unity, and unity the key element in the shaping of the citizen. Probably no other country has put so much effort into primary and secondary education as France. The name of one historian has become to embody that endeavor, Ernest Lavis, who was both the author of a manual of primary school teachers published in millions of copies, to which might be attributed the moral and patriotic resistance of the soldiers in the trenches at Verdun, and the architect of a classic 27-volume history of France, published between 1903 and the aftermath of the First World War. It is he who is credited with forging the epic Roman National, the tale, the narrative of the nation, which, from Vercingétorix to the victory of 1918, from the Crusades to the Enlightenment, from Louis XIV and Napoleon to the colonial expeditions, shaped generations of Frenchmen. You might be the grandson of an aristocrat guillotined by the revolution, or the son of a worker shot during the Commune, the son of old Breton peasants of a recent Italian immigrant. You might be a native of Algeria or Black Africa. In the classroom, all had the now emblematic catchphrase drummed into them, nos ancêtres les Gaulois, our ancestors the Gauls. In short, France was for a long time bound by a double narrative. On one hand, There was the official history, a conflicted history, no doubt, with multiple versions and interpretations, but a unifying one. On the other, private memories, whether social, religious, sexual, ethnic, provincial, or familial, all of them memories of a particular group kept alive in the privacy of the family. Here again, the case of the Jews is exemplary. Up until a relatively late date, when the Shoah and the return of huge numbers of North African Jews gave rise to an identity-based consciousness of community, French Jews, who were referred to moreover as Israelite, the use of the word Jew being more often reserved for anti-Semitism, were Jews at home and at the synagogue, but fully assimilated French citizens in the public sphere. In this, it is this double narrative that was shattered in the space of a few years, sometimes in the late 70s. At that point, specific minority groups set out in search of their memory, their history in the world. The buzzword at the time was recuperation. The particularly spectacular demise of France's peasant population between 45 and 75, for example, gave rise to the need to recover what traces remained of its past, its rural past, a need crystallized in 1972 by the creation of the Musée des Arts et Traditions Populaires, Museum of Folk Arts and Traditions. Similarly, the demise of working-class France gave rise not only to industrial anthropology, with all the problems posed by the demolition, preservation, or reconversion of factories and buildings, but also, for instance, to Jean Métron's famous and monumental Dictionnaire biographique du mouvement ouvrier français, biographical dictionary of the French labor movement, containing 150,000 articles on well-known or obscure working-class lives. The emancipation of women gave rise to the Mouvement de Libération des Femmes, and 30 or 40 years ago, as I mentioned earlier, no one in France would have spoken of a special Jewish memory and identity. After the Eichmann trial, however, after the Six-Day War and the repatriation of the North African Jews, it wasn't long before a community-based Jewish memory emerged. For those of you who are interested in the subject, there is a chapter devoted to it in my book, Recherche de la France. The affirmation of all these minority and identity-based memory appeared at first to be powerfully liberating. It was endowed with an ethical dimension and presented itself as a kind of justice done to the victims, those who had been overlooked by history, downtoned and oppressed. It was the personal history of those, all those, passed over in silence by official history. It gave rise to an equally new interest on the part of historians in the humble artisans of history. And with this nouvelle histoire came a rapid broadening of the question posed by research, a complete overhaul of the discipline, in fact. Oral history, labor history, rural history, women's history marked, among others, this welcome upsurge in the memorial dimension of history. Memory has been fertile for historians. It has renewed our approach to every aspect of the past and overrun every period and area of research. Things started to go in the wrong way when history, which belongs to no one and consists of ensuring that the past is of concern to all of us, was written exclusively under pressure from individual memory groups with a vested interest in ensuring that their own particular interpretation carried the day. Memory became militant, and a very different change was set in motion, and upheaval, the implication of which were altogether different. A memory that was modest in scope and asked only to be recognized, respected, and set down in the great ledger of collective history, gave way to a memory that was agonistic, accusatory in essence, and even destructive of collective history. A memory that foisted a partial and warped view onto a broader interpretation of history and was prepared in the name of suffering and truth to enforce its demands by any means necessary. A good example of this is colonial memory and the manner in which its history has been written. In a sense, the colonial question, which was articulated mainly through migrant communities from Africa and the Antilles, was just one more example in France, at least, of the memorial outburst that had spread through all minority groups. And what it appeared to be demanding seemed to be of the same order as earlier minority memories, whether Jewish, labor, or feminist, or regional memories, like those of the people of Corsica and Brittany. It was legitimate, it was necessary even, to open up the history of the French nation to the history of its former colonies, and to integrate that history along with the history of colonial slavery, which was little discussed at the time, in our historical and cultural heritage. But the problem posed by the upsurge in memories of former colonial peoples went much further than that, and soon pitted those who thought that France's colonial adventure had ultimately engaged few of the constants of national identity against those who felt that the whole question of French identity needed to be thought through afresh in post-colonial terms, the true nature of national identity having been revealed to reside to a large extent in colonial oppression and the denial of that oppression. Not only could colonial history no longer be set down in the great ledger of national history, but France's entire national history would have to be rewritten in the black light of colonization. This self-lacerating approach to the past was even enshrined in French law. In 201, the Taubira Act, named after the Member of Parliament for Guyana, and who had tabled the bill, Christine Taubira, not the current but the ex-now French Justice Minister, recognized Western slavery and the European transatlantic slave trade since the 15th century as a crime against humanity. In the civil war between different versions of memory, that law led to another one. Returnees from Algeria and former supporters of French Algeria pushed through a law, quote, expressing the gratitude of the nation to French returnees and requiring school curricula and textbooks to accord colonization the positive role it deserves, unquote. There is, however, a sin inherent in the retrospective application of the concept of crime against humanity. In itself, the creation of the concept at the Nuremberg trials might appear to mark an advance in universal conscience. It was designed, however, for unbelievable crimes, the horror and scale of which went beyond those of war crimes, and for which there was no legal provision at that time. It made it possible to prosecute the authors of those crimes right up to the time of their death, with no statute of limitation. But applying the concept of crimes against humanity to remote periods of time leads us down two slippery slopes: boundless retroactivity of the law and generalized victimization in respect of the past. The only people open to prosecution would be the historians who took the liberty of discussing that past. This drift towards widespread memorial reinterpretation leads directly to the abolition of any form of reasoned historical inquiry. By definition, memory denies temporal differences and eradicates the agencies and conditions of change. It's no longer a question of understanding the past on its own terms, of reconstructing the chain of events that have made us who we are, but of imposing directly on any phenomenon from the past a judgment founded solely on the values and criteria of today, as though those values and criteria did not themselves have a history and had existed since time immemorial. We live today convinced of and enthralled to the rights of individuals. In some ways, it is a welcome development, but those rights themselves have a long story. Memory has secretly been contaminated by morality, and morality has devoured history. It was to combat this trend, particularly at the time of the law of colonization of 205 and the Taubira Act, that a group of historians came together to found the association Freedom from History. Freedom for History, of course. For History. Presided over first by René Raymond, then by myself. The aim of the association was to defend history from political interference and to oppose any law that gave a definition of the past and made punishable by a fine or a prison sentence anyone who contested that definition. First and foremost, the historian. In addition to the two laws already mentioned, a law passed in 2001 officially recognized the Armenian genocide of 1915, a tragedy for which France was in no way responsible. A dozen other laws were in draft at the time on the Gypsies, the war in the Vendée, and the Ukrainian famine of 1932-33. There was even a draft law incriminating the Crusades as the first Western crime against the Arab world. All these bills and laws were inspired by the Guesso Act, which in 1990 made negation of the Jewish genocide punishable under the law. The Guesso Act, which is completely justified, is not, strictly speaking, a memorial law. Passed at a time when Holocaust denial was growing in France, it was a law designed, on the contrary, to protect historical truth from those who would falsify history. The Guesso Act, however, has served as a model for other draft laws which, on the contrary, sought to prevent the diktats of memory from being openly discussed by historians. All these laws owed their existence to the wishes of a particular religious or ethnic community to have their particular memories taken into consideration by the national community through the intermediary of history, which was taken hostage in this way. Freedom for History set itself the task, therefore, of defending both the scholarly side of research and education and the historian's freedom of expressions when faced with political interference or ideological pressures, regardless of their nature or origin. The task took on an international dimension in 2010, when a ruling handed down by the European Court. In the name of the legitimate fight against racism and anti-Semitism, the European decree makes punishable under European law, quote, any public apology, negation, or trivialization of crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes, unquote. The moral thinking behind the ruling was excellent, but as history, alas, is simply one long series of crime, the way is now open for the criminalization of any number of national history. Israel, as you know, is not exempt from such a charge. The cause defended by Freedom for History and the historians associated with it, 1,000 members now, goes far beyond the fight against memorial laws. It even goes beyond the defense of the right to free expression under a democratic regime. The present day lives under the dictatorship of the present and the tyranny of memory. The historian is himself caught up in this trend and lives under its sway. No one would dare say today, as he would in the past, that is of no time or country. Everyone knows he is rooted in his time, his family, his personal experiences, and is a prisoner of his own memory. But to my mind, the best justification for history today is in the effort to free oneself from it, to stand back and consider the events of today in a more enduring light, to escape from the clutches of memory by attempting to analyze history, its history, and by practicing the profession of historian as Mark Locke defined it. This is what I, for my part, attempted to do when I embarked in the 80s together with a large team of historians in realms of history, realms of memory, les lieux de mémoire. Thank you.
Good evening, thank you. We know it's pretty chilly here, and we try to take care of that too. We want to make sure you have good memories of this evening. I can think of great many easier tasks than serving as a commentator for a talk made by Professor Pierre Nora. What an honor and what a challenge. Professor Nora's work is a constitutive moment in the history of memory studies around the world, certainly no less and probably much more. So thank you, Professor Nili Cohen and Professor Yadin Dudai, who couldn't be with us, for putting this together and for letting a sociologist, nobody's perfect, to comment on an address made by a historian. First and foremost, Professor Nora, you must be a very, very special person, for I've only very rarely met people who actually criticize their own work, especially work that has made them famous all over the world. It is a fascinating address about an academic study that enjoyed too much success. While you may be looking with discomfort at the fact that Café du Croissant became a heritage site and enjoy legal protection, I'm sure that people have done far worse things in their life. Second, I agree with you that the present is inextricably bound up with memory, that memory contains both beauty and horror, or in other words, is at the same time liberating and also a burden, that we preserve too much and forget too little, that from the duty to remember, we have become a world full of slaves to memory, that heritage is taken to the extreme and that the world has changed tremendously, to some extent for the better and to some extent for the worse. At the same time, I would like to make 4 comments, one about history and memory, one about what I think is the essence of the problem,
one about science, and a final one about balance and hope, if I may. So let me begin with history and memory. Yes, the use of the term memory, individual and collective, has been imprecise, occasionally profligate. The concept of memory may become indistinguishable from either identity or culture. It suffers from semantic overload, losing its precise denotation. Some of the overuse is perhaps the result of the boom in memory itself. It was so successful that it became a buzzword for anything and everything that had to do with the past, and in effect, it sold pretty well. But I think that what we need to do is to distinguish between memory as a phenomena and memory studies as a discipline. Studying and theorizing memory allows us to shift our focus from time to temporalities, and thus to understand what categories people, groups, and culture employ to make sense of their life, their social, cultural, and political attachments, and the ideals that they are validated. No less important is the issue, or perhaps the tension between historiography and memory, which Professor Nora raises, a divide that is basically an epistemological one. Briefly and somewhat superficially, there are those who see history and memory as entirely distinct from each other, usually implying that memory is inferior, and those who see them as contiguous and continuous with each other. Many historians' discussions of memory concern either oral history or the value of testimony and eyewitness accounts. But eyewitness accounts are notoriously unreliable. So while oral history has aimed at recovering voices omitted from traditional historiography has been wary of such approaches, and perhaps rightly so. The unreliability of individual memory is often cited as the reason to maintain the distinction between history and collective memory. However, the poor epistemological status of memory, distorted and distorting, should have no bearing on history interest in commemoration, which is the tangible way for which we feel and know memory. So it should have no bearing on history interest in commemoration, for example, as an activity with history and as an opportunity to discuss the role of history in society. Moreover, I'm not really sure that memory denies temporal differences and eradicates the agencies and conditions of change. The assumption that memory is affected only by present needs and circumstances denies the role of the past in shaping memory, a role we know exists. Second comment, are we mourning the loss of history as a discipline, as a body of knowledge? Are we mourning the fact that the present has achieved precedent over the past and the future? Is it about the loss of the scientific method? All of the above? I have a feeling that the problem that Professor Nora points at should not be laid at the doorstep of memory, but at the heart of society that has lost its compass. What is happening to history is just the tip of the iceberg in a much larger phenomena. I agree with our distinguished guests that we're increasingly witnessing acquired memory rather than transmitted memory. Rather than study about the Holocaust and World War II and racism, the State of Israel, for example, invests to trips to death camps in Poland, but not bothering to visit the country of the actual perpetrators, but worse than that, trips that are filled to the brim with emotional rituals and tears. This is not just about experienced and acquired memory, but it is about experienced and acquired education. And this is, in my opinion, a much bigger problem than memory. When Professor Nora describes the changes that took place in France and which also occurred in many other, mainly Western societies, he is not referring only to the loss of power of historians, to the memory people, but the loss of respect once attributed to other social institutions in human life. I suspect that Professor Nora puts quite a heavy load on the memory precursor's shoulders. And if memory could give way to history, would that actually change so much around us? Third point had to do with the social context of science. I hope history belongs to no one, as you said. I also hope that medical research, for example, and other scientific discipline belongs to no one. While we assume and hope that history and medical research are carried out the right way, there is little doubt that power relations, funding issues, competitive grants, and other factors have roles to play in the field as well and affect the kind of topics chosen for one's scientific endeavor. We hope that this does not affect the results, but we are no longer naive about science. No one claims that history that is written or the medicine that is studied is distorted, but we are well aware that this is not the only history or the only medical research that could have been undertaken. So the idea that certain groups demand that their history also be written is not a bad idea. So the idea that certain groups demand that their history also be written is not a bad idea. It may make our scholarly work more diverse in a good way. What would be a bad idea is if at the end of the day, we end up with sloppy scholarship, mediocre science, undocumented work, and the like. The fact that new groups have demanded that their history be recorded does not automatically generate bad science. Bad science generates bad history. Political interventions generate bad science, history included. A mediocre higher education generates bad science and history included. So what we need to be concerned about is not the tyranny of memory or the tyranny of the memory people, but the freedom of academics to be able to conduct serious research free of threats, free of weird and strange laws, and full of curiosity and rigorous methodology. Looking around at our distinguished hosts at this building, I think that we're in the right place to say that. It is the duty of the national academics of science around the world to ensure that science is conducted in the right way and that we are free to do so. The Freedom of History Association, established and chaired by our guest, is a brilliant idea. In light of recent events in Israel, I think that we could benefit from such an association, but it would need to include not only historians, but also scholars from the humanities and the social sciences, and perhaps from other disciplines as well. While I totally agree that some of the memory work has gotten out of control, our problem lies where politicians and radical groups interfere and attempt to impose censorship, where fear becomes our academic advisor and silence our solution. One last comment. Memory has become a right. We heard about it yesterday. And hence, no wonder we now find ourselves in an era that also seeks the right to be forgotten. While I certainly don't underestimate the power of symbols, I often feel that governments have sold us too cheaply. They give us a memorial day, a monument, even a museum, but not what we really need: food, education, housing, medical care, and peace. I think that at the end of the day, what we wish to have is more balance. We want to live in states that are not judged, or not only judged, how well they atone for their past misdeeds, but on how well they meet their fiscal obligations and inspire future projects, how they ensure that the future will have less to apologize for. Thank you very much.
Well, a fascinating lecture, a fascinating comment. And Professor Nora, would you like to relate to the comment, a comment to the comment?
Yes, perhaps. Well, I shall ask the aid of a translator for my answer because it's rather complicated to answer in English. So I shall do it in French and translator will translate. 2 or 3 points only. First point about the commémoration. Oui, les commémorations sont un phénomène compliqué.
Commemoration is a complex phenomenon.
C'est un phénomène de mémoire.
It's a phenomenon of memory.
C'est la manière dont le présent juge et ressent et revit le passé.
It's the manner in which present relives and judges and appreciates the past.
La façon aussi dont il se sert du passé.
And also the manner in which it utilizes the past.
Mais en même temps, en général, c'est une occasion unique d'approfondir un problème d'histoire.
But generally speaking, it is also an opportunity to go deeper and delve deeper into an issue of history.
Je prends un tout petit exemple, c'est le travail de notre ami le professeur Avner Ben-Amos.
One example could be the work of our friend Professor Ben-Amos.
Il a écrit un livre sur les funérailles nationales.
He wrote a book about national funerals.
Mais c'était en même temps une grande époque de commémoration en France. Je ne peux pas toutes les énumérer, c'est toute une dérive de commémoration, un déluge de commémoration.
It was also an era of numerous commemoration expressions or events in France. There was an avalanche of commemoration events.
Mais le fait qu'un historien, pour la première fois peut-être, étudie un grand phénomène de commémoration,
The fact that a historian
se rencontrer.
The fact that a historian studies for the first time a phenomenon of reminiscing, of remembering, of memory, made the two meet.
Deuxième point.
And the second point.
Les rapports, en fait, de l'histoire et de la mémoire.
The relationship between history and memory.
C'est très compliqué.
It's very complex.
On peut dire au départ
One might say at the outset
que sans la mémoire,
that without memory,
il n'y a pas d'histoire.
there's no history.
L'histoire est née de la mémoire.
History is born out of memory.
Et la naissance de l'histoire scientifique
And
au XIXe siècle
the birth of scientific history in the 19th century
s'est présentée dans un premier temps comme l'approfondissement de la mémoire collective, sa vérification par les archives, par les documents. Dans un premier temps.
And at the first stage, this took the shape of a deepening or going more profoundly into collective memories and checking them out against the facts or information that was stored in archives.
En même temps,
At the same
c'était
time,
une critique de cette mémoire collective.
it was a criticism of this collective memory.
Et l'histoire scientifique s'est développée
And scientific history evolved
comme une critique analytique de l'acquis de la mémoire collective.
as an analytical criticism of the acquired knowledge of history.
Inversement, beaucoup d'historiens
On the other
ont
hand,
été au départ des acteurs, des témoins et des victimes de l'histoire. Les premières histoires de la Shoah ont été faites par d'anciennes victimes de la Shoah. Le fait d'être soi-même dans une poussée inspirée par la mémoire ne veut pas dire qu'on fasse de la mauvaise histoire.
Historians in the beginning were actually actors or players, witnesses, victims of history. The very early histories appeared after the Holocaust, and they were actually written or created by the victims of the Holocaust. So the fact that one is inspired by one's personal history or personal experience does not necessarily create bad history.
On peut dire la même chose des historiens du mouvement ouvrier.
And one might say the
La
same
plupart
thing
étaient nés du peuple et du peuple ouvrier.
about historians of the labor movement. Most of them came from within that movement.
Troisième point,
Third point,
le contexte social.
the social context.
Les légères différences
Slight differences
entre Vered et moi
between Vered and myself
viennent, je pense, de ce qu'elle est sociologue.
emanate of the fact, so I believe that she's a sociologist.
Et j'ai une approche très historienne
My approach is very historical
de la mémoire.
to memory.
Il y a toute une histoire sociale de la mémoire.
There's a whole full-blown history of the social aspect of memory.
Par exemple,
For instance,
j'ai essayé d'étudier, et peut-être que Avner Ben Amos s'en souvient, les statues de Paris. Statues, les sculptures of the streets in Paris, the statues, the portraits.
I tried, as Avner Ben Amos might recall, I tried to study the sculptures in Paris.
Il y a une manière sociologique de faire cette étude de la mémoire.
There is a sociological approach to this particular study of memory.
Premier point, est-ce qu'on les regarde?
First point, do we look at them?
Est-ce qu'on les identifie quand on passe devant?
Do we identify them as we go by?
Pour qui ces statues veulent dire quelque chose?
And what do these sculptures have to say to different people?
Des militants les détruisent,
Militants would destroy them, they're against them,
etc.
and so on and so forth.
Une approche historienne
A historian's approach, on the other hand,
est beaucoup plus symbolique.
is much more symbolic.
C'est le fait qu'elles aient été
It's the fact
construites
that
et
they
le
were,
fait qu'elles existent.
it's the fact that they were erected, the fact that they're there, that they exist,
Ce qu'elles veulent signifier qui est important.
what they mean. That is what is truly important.
Et pas qui les regarde ou ne les regarde pas.
And not the question who looks upon them and who doesn't.
Voilà, ce sont quelques points, mais si Vered veut bien m'envoyer son comment, je le commenterai par écrit.
These were just a couple of points, but if Vered would be so kind as to send me her comment, I would comment on the comment in writing.
Thank you very much. So now we won't have a comment to the comment to the comment, but, well, we have a wonderful audience, and would it be okay to have 2 questions from the audience?
Or three.
Or 3. So, please.
So, thank you very much.
One moment, please.
Sorry?
One moment.
Thank you very much. I would have put my question to you in French, but I want everyone to understand, so I ask it in English. And the question is, what is exactly the role of the nation in your study of memory and history? You mentioned the nation a few times. You know, Ernest Renan, as you of course know, said that the nation is a collective of people who are characterized not only by what they remember collectively, but also by what they choose to forget collectively. Of course, nations have different ways of recording history and of developing collective memory. So sometimes you have a national history of one nation which contradicts completely the national history of another. You can take, for example, the way that the Algerians and the French looked at what happened in Algeria in the 1950s or 60s, and you can take the local example of the war of 1948 and how the Jews and the Arabs look at it. So I wonder what the place of the nation is as a collective, perhaps as an imagined collective, as a symbolic collective, in your study of memory and history. Thank you very much.
J'ai été certainement impressionné
I was certainly most impressed
par le fait que je me suis spontanément posé le problème de la mémoire nationale française.
so much so that I said to myself to study the issue of the French national memory.
Et c'est quand j'ai eu terminé
It's when I finished that
que je me suis aperçu que je n'avais étudié en fait que les retombées en France dans une nation spéciale d'un problème beaucoup plus général, mondial, de la mémoire.
I realized that in fact what I had studied was merely the repercussions within this one particular state, France in that case, of what had happened on a much more general scale.
Au point
So
que
much
j'ai
so
pensé que ce que j'avais fait
that I thought
n'était
that
pas exportable,
what I had done could not be exported,
and uniquement lié à la France.
and it was solely linked to France,
Et c'était faux.
and that was wrong.
Alors, c'est évident que chaque pays
It's quite clear that each country
a un rapport spécial à son propre passé
each state has its own particular approach to its own past
et un rapport très égoïste.
and a very egoistic approach.
C'est un énorme problème qui fait peut-être partie de la démocratisation dont j'ai parlé hier.
It's a
C'est
giant
que tous les
problem,
pays
an immense problem, and it's probably part of this democratization process that I related to yesterday.
l'Algérie par exemple,
In every country, and take Algeria as an example.
pendant la guerre d'indépendance,
During the war on independence,
a reconstruit imaginairement son passé
it has in fact reconstructed through imagination. It
en
has reconstructed
prétendant
its
que la
history,
nation algérienne
claiming that the Algerian nation
existait avant la colonisation
existed prior to
et
colonization,
que la colonisation l'avait détruite.
and that colonization had destroyed it.
Il est évident aussi
It's also evident
que les Algériens aujourd'hui
that Algerians today
ont beaucoup de mal à faire l'histoire de l'Algérie.
find it very
de la guerre.
difficult to historicize Algeria and the war.
Deux raisons.
And there are two reasons for that.
La première, c'est
First.
qu'il y a eu une bataille autour des archives algériennes de la colonisation.
There was a battle, a fierce battle about the archives of the colonization period in Algeria.
Les Français ont emporté dans la hâte toutes les archives dont ils disposaient
The French, leaving Algeria in haste, took away with them practically all the archives they could lay their hands on.
et les Algériens ont prétendu que le dernier acte de la colonisation
And the
était
Algerians-
cet arrachement de leurs propres archives.
And the Algerians claimed that the very last act of colonization was the removal or the taking away of their archives.
Elles sont maintenant installées à Aix-en-Provence.
And these archives are now at Aix-en-Provence.
Mais la deuxième raison,
And the second reason
c'est que les archives algériennes proprement dites de la guerre
that the Algerian archives of the war
restent secrètes
remain secret,
et ne sont
confidential,
pas à la disposition des chercheurs sur la guerre d'Algérie.
and are not accessible to researchers of the war in Algeria.
Voilà un exemple parmi beaucoup d'autres.
So this is just one of many examples.
Vous avez fait allusion à Israël.
You have mentioned Israel.
C'est à certains égards un problème qui répond à votre question.
In some respects, it is a problem that tallies with your question.
En effet, il y a, comme vous le savez mieux que moi, une histoire révisionniste des débuts de la naissance d'Israël.
As you know certainly better than I do, there is a revisionist tendency as to the history of the early years of the State of Israel.
Et d'une manière générale, comme beaucoup de pays,
Generally speaking, like in many countries,
Israël a tendance aussi à faire sa propre histoire et à refaire l'histoire générale à partir de l'histoire du peuple juif.
Israel tends to remake its history and history at large based on the history of the Jewish people.
Nous devons faire avec.
We have to contend with that.
Et essayer de dépasser cette mémoire personnelle.
We have to try to go beyond this personalized type of history.
Alors, pour faire la mienne,
As far as mine is concerned,
je dirais, pour justifier ce que j'ai fait,
to justify what I have done,
que le cas de la France, comme j'ai essayé de l'expliquer,
the case of France, as I've tried to explain it,
est assez exemplaire
is quite exemplary
parce que tous les paramètres de la mémoire
because all parameters of memory
sont concentrés contre l'histoire officielle.
are concentrated against or pitted against official history.
D'autres pays en Europe, comme l'Allemagne,
In other countries in Europe, such as Germany,
a eu sa conscience collective
they had their collective consciousness,
fait à partir du Volk, du peuple et de la langue.
which emanated out of the people and language.
Certains pays d'Europe centrale,
Some Central
C'est
European
plutôt-
countries,
c'est plutôt le folk, le folklore, à partir duquel la conscience nationale est née. Les
it
pays d'Europe
was
centrale.
folklore out of which emanated the local consciousness.
Israël, c'est trois choses.
In Israel, it's three things:
Le mouvement sioniste
the Zionist
est
movement
religieux,
and religious movement,
différent.
two different aspects.
C'est l'histoire du peuple juif
The history of the Jewish people
et c'est la Shoah.
and the Shoah, of course.
Bon, c'est à partir de ces éléments que
And it's based on
Un
those
pays.
elements
a fait extraordinaire conscience nationale à partir de l'idée de la renaissance d'une langue
that wonderful, great things have occurred based on national consciousness. For one, the revival of the Hebrew language,
est une chose unique dans l'histoire
which is really unique in history.
et certainement un élément unificateur intense.
And it's definitely a very powerful, unifying element.
Cela dit, nous voyons bien
Having said that, we see
qu'il y a plusieurs versions aujourd'hui
that there are many versions
parmi
prevailing
les
today
historiens
among historians,
de l'histoire même d'Israël.
many versions of the history of Israel itself.
Donc voilà, je crois que c'est difficile d'en dire plus.
Well,
I
you know,
believe it would be difficult to say more than that.
well, thank you so much. You allowed 3 questions, right? So we have 2 more, Michal and this gentleman. Michal.
Thank you. Thank you again very much for the continuation of the lecture yesterday in what I would define the most non-politically correct lecture I've heard lately.
Really?
Yes. And courageously so. I would like to stress one element that came through your lecture, which was victimhood and suffering. Victimhood and suffering as the emergence of the trend of memory and the reversal of memory from a claim to be part into revendication and militant and violent memory in the name of victimization. You've based that in the memory of the Shoah, and then you showed how that was inflated and became out of proportion. And I think that in Israel we live in a very tragic way a competition of victimhood between us and the Palestinians. My question is just asking back from my own point of view as an artist to the more symbolical dimension of history and of writing of history. And I would just refer to the mode the Jews have written their history. For example, the history of the slavery in Egypt. And in that, I would suggest or ask, maybe a way out of it would be against the obsession of data and of memory mainly of suffering, a mode of forgetfulness or of articulation of the memory, not only into the duty to remember, or the responsibility to remember, but how to remember as a responsible act for the present. Don't we have to apply, as I asked yesterday, ethics to memory? And for example, the slavery of Egypt brought us the Sabbath, brought us the laws against slavery, opening for the foreign in the society. It was not a rumination of the past, but taking it into the present, as you stated, but not the inflation of the present as such, but how a background of a memory can shape our responsibility for a different present. In that sense, I myself oppose our government use of the Shoah as victimhood in the present, and would ask you as a historian, what is your take on that?
Well, Professor Nora, thank you, Michal. Professor Nora, I suggest to have the last question so you could relate to both questions together. Thank you. Michael,
Hey, my name is George Hintlian. I'm a historian of Armenian genocide since 50 years. So I'll be very short, and it's a comment. First, thank you for admitting that there was an Armenian genocide, and you're very kind there. But you very well know, as somebody living in France, that it's not individual deniers like the Shoah, it's a whole state, Turkey, which is mobilized in denial. So I think the Armenians have the right to defend themselves in the framework of legality or whatever, or a legislation. So here in Jerusalem and in Israel, in the country of the Shoah, I would have preferred that Armenian issue was not included in this lecture, because I'm an admirer of your books. I have all your books, and I follow your activity. So I'm being very disciplined, but it's painful for me as an Armenian to see the classification of Armenian genocide like any other minority or labor movement. There is no need for a hierarchy here. Thank you.
Les deux questions sont assez différentes.
These two questions are, of course, quite different from each other.
Madame, sur votre question, d'abord l'oubli.
Madam, on your question and on forgetting,
Il faut d'abord dire que l'oubli est évident, nécessaire,
one should say
salubre,
that forgetting is very necessary, very important, it's even healthy.
et Ernest Renan donnait comme définition de la nation
Ernest Renan defined the nation
que c'est un ensemble de gens qui se souviennent d'avoir fait de grandes choses ensemble,
as a group of
qui
people
veulent en
who
faire ensemble,
remember having done great things together,
que la nation est un plébiscite de tous les jours,
and it is in fact a referendum, like a daily referendum,
mais qu'elle est en même temps fondée sur l'oubli.
but it is at the same time based on forgetting.
Cela dit, dessiner les traits de la mémoire, c'est dessiner les traits de l'oubli.
But to
Pour
try
un
to
historien.
describe, for a historian, to try to describe the features of history is tantamount to describing the features of forgetting.
On m'a beaucoup reproché dans les lieux de mémoire
I was often criticized about the realms of memory
de ne pas avoir traité les lieux de l'oubli.
for not having addressed the realms of forgetting,
Tous ceux dont la France peut avoir honte.
or those that France should be ashamed of.
Mais j'ai toujours pensé que que faire les lieux, que montrer là où elle a sa mémoire était montrer en même temps ce qu'elle oubliait.
But I always was of the opinion that to show what France should remember was tantamount to showing what it has forgotten.
Alors, vous avez évoqué la concurrence des victimes.
You have mentioned the competition, sort of, between the victims.
C'est vrai,
It is true.
c'est un immense problème.
It is a gigantic problem.
En même temps, je suis de ceux qui pensent
But at
que
the
la
same time,
Shoah est un phénomène unique.
but at the same time, I'm one of those who are of the belief that the Shoah was something completely different, completely unique,
Pour une raison
for one reason.
essentielle, c'est l'industrialisation de la mort.
The industrialization of death.
Dans les autres génocides,
In other genocides,
il n'y a pas ce phénomène.
that phenomenon is not there.
Il change tout.
And that changes everything.
Pour venir au problème plus général du génocide,
And to go back to the more general issue of genocide,
c'est un mot à la fois indispensable
it is a word that at one at the same time is a word that we cannot do without,
et dont les historiens se méfient beaucoup,
but that historians are very wary about.
au point que beaucoup d'historiens
So much
conseillent
so
de ne pas l'employer,
that many historians advise
sauf
to
pour la
avoid
Shoah,
using it, with the exception of the Shoah, the Holocaust,
mais plutôt d'utiliser des expressions comme massacre de masse,
but other than using expressions such as mass extermination or mass murders
ou tuerie de masse,
or butchery, mass butchery,
ou meurtre collectif.
or a collective murder,
Parce que depuis 10, 15 ou 30 ans,
because for the past 15, 20 or 30 years,
l'expression génocide
the
est
expression
devenue un
of
code,
genocide has become a code,
un symbole,
a symbol,
beaucoup plus qu'une vérité historique
much
difficile
more
à démontrer.
than historic veracity, which would be difficult to prove and to show.
Par exemple,
For example,
un historien français
a French historian
a étudié les traites négrières,
studied about the slave trade,
celles transatlantiques,
both the
faites par les Européens,
transatlantic one perpetrated by the Europeans,
les traites des Noirs par les Noirs, les traites négrières faites par les rois nègres,
and and slave trade, black slave trade of black slaves by black traders.
Et les traites faites par les Arabes.
And those by the Arabs.
Il a été fortement attaqué.
And he was very fiercely criticized.
Et même physiquement attaqué.
And also physically attacked.
Par des groupes de Noirs.
By groups of blacks.
De la Réunion, de la Guyane.
Réunion, Guyane.
Ils l'ont coincé et ils lui ont demandé si les traites n'étaient pas un génocide.
They attacked him physically. I mean, they seized him and they demanded to know from him whether the slave trade was not a form of genocide.
Il a dit non.
And he said no.
Ce n'est pas un génocide parce que l'objectif de la traite
This is not a genocide because the object,
n'était pas le meurtre.
The purpose of the slave trade was not to
C'était
kill.
la conservation de la force de travail.
It was simply maintaining a labor force.
Alors, j'en viens au fond du problème.
So I'm coming now to the crux of the matter.
Moralement,
Morally speaking,
c'était un génocide.
it was a genocide.
Et tous les meurtres dont monsieur a parlé sont des génocides.
And the murders and the case that the gentleman has mentioned and spoken about are a genocide.
Le massacre des Arméniens est incontestablement une forme de génocide.
And what happened with the Armenians was definitely a form of genocide.
Puisque le crime contre l'humanité et l'expression génocide
Since crime against
a
humanity
été inventé au moment des procès de Nuremberg par Lemkin.
These concepts of crimes against humanity and genocide were invented by
Sur
Lemkin at the
l'exemple
time of the Nuremberg
des
trials,
Arméniens.
based on the Armenian example.
C'est-à-dire que sur le plan moral,
So morally speaking,
déclarer que le massacre des Arméniens est un génocide, je suis tout à fait d'accord.
declaring that the massacre of the Armenians was a genocide, I'm completely and in full agreement of that.
Mais le reconnaître juridiquement
But to recognize that legally
est une pression sur les Turcs.
it is a pressure that is exerted against the Turks.
C'est la seule raison de le faire.
And it's the only reason to do that.
Il y avait une raison forte pour faire la loi Guesso en France.
There was a very strong reason to create the Guesso law or act in France.
Parce qu'il y avait une poussée d'antisémitisme.
Because there was a surge of anti-Semitism.
Il n'y a absolument aucune poussée anti-arménienne en France.
But there's absolutely no anti-Armenian movement of any kind in France.
Donc il n'y a aucune raison
So there is no reason
de faire une loi,
to create a law, to legislate,
sauf pour faire pression, encore une fois, sur la Turquie.
with the only exception of exerting pressure on Turkey.
Sauf que ce serait le contraire comme résultat de ce que l'on veut.
That would lead to exactly the opposite result of what we are seeking.
Il est évident qu'une telle loi prise en France
It is quite clear that such a law
ne ferait
in France
que déclencher un réflexe nationaliste en Turquie,
all that it would achieve is to arouse a nationalistic wave in Turkey.
Qu'est-ce qu'on aurait dit si en France,
What would we say if in France,
pendant la guerre d'Algérie,
during the Algerian War,
la Turquie avait condamné juridiquement la France
Turkey would have legally condemned France
pour torture?
for torture?
La France aurait serré les coudes.
France would have had a very strong reaction.
C'est pourquoi je pense que cette pression pour faire de l'Arménie une loi qui punit la négation du génocide arménien, que personne ne nie,
That is why I believe that legislating an act that would exert a legal punishment on anyone denying the Armenian genocide, which no one denies,
est inutile et contre-productive.
Is unnecessary and counterproductive.
Voilà la réponse que j'ai à faire au monsieur.
The answer that I could give you, sir.
Well, thank you very much, our distinguished guest, Pierre Nora, for the fascinating evening you created. Thank you very much, my dear friend Miriam, Eliav-Feldon, and Vinitzky-Seroussi for the fascinating introduction and comment. And thank you, the wonderful audience. If I want to sum up in one sentence, it was a memorable evening. Thank you.